I decided to make a custom lathe cover for my Grizzly G0602 lathe, and I'm using the process that was outlined by Barry Young on projectsinmetal.com. And the process is basically to go to Harbor Freight and buy a cheap 5-foot by 7-foot tarp, throw it over the lathe, and then everywhere that the tarp overlaps, you pin it with straight pins, and then you cut off the excess. And once you have all the excess cut off, you can use the tarp as a pattern to sew a regular cloth cover. And I'm going to be using a heavyweight, almost like a jean fabric. I think they call it duck, and it'll be black. So the next step here is to trim off all this excess, and then I'll be ready with my pattern. You'll notice that one of the things that I did that I don't think Barry did that made it a lot easier was adding magnets to the process. I didn't have a second person out here helping me put the tarp over the lathe and hold it in place, so I just used some rather strong and cheap magnets that I also got at Harbor Freight to hold the tarp in place while I pinned it. So I'll be back in a second after I trim off all the excess. Alright, so now after I've trimmed everything away, the tarp is really starting to look like a custom fit cover. And one thing that I haven't done yet is my wife suggested that I cut notches in each of the seams so that when I transfer this pattern to the fabric, I'll also cut those same notches, and then when I go to sew the seams together, I'll line up those notches so that I know that the two sides of the seam are lined up. So that was her idea, and I trust her, so I'm going to do that. And then the other thing I did, the handle was causing the tarp to kind of billow out right here, the handle on the cross slide. So I just pulled this in a little bit and pinned it and trimmed it, and that'll be another little seam. And all I'll need to do whenever I put the tarp over, or the cover over, is just make sure that cross slide is in roughly the middle of the middle of the lathe, and then the tarp or the cover will fit just fine. So here's the other side, and you know, this lathe obviously isn't a complete square, and so you definitely have to make some adjustments to make it fit nice, but I think it worked out pretty well. I'm hoping that the cover will look even better once the seams are turned inside out. Now, one other thing I need to do is mark on this tarp that this is the side facing out, so that I can flip the tarp inside out before I cut out the pattern, and that's also outlined in Barry's article. So that's it for now. I'll pull this off of here and lay it out on the fabric and cut it out. Alright, so now everything is cut out, and you'll notice that I left about an inch strip all the way around at the bottom of the cover, and that's so once I get it in place on the lathe, I can turn it under and make sure that it's all nice and level with the tabletop, and then sew that last seam all the way around the cover along the bottom. So next it's time to take the tarp off and start sewing up the cover. Okay, so here's a good example of why it's necessary to put those notches in place. Now I understand what my wife was talking about. When you actually go to sew the seams together, you'll notice that sometimes the bottom portion doesn't line up, and if you were to try and line these two pieces up to where they overlapped perfectly, then the little notch that you cut right here wouldn't line up. So the purpose again of those notches is to just make sure that you're lining up the seam in the appropriate spot. So there's two pieces of fabric here with a little slit cut here. I just cut the slit right in the middle of the notch that I cut in the pattern. And then by lining up that slit, I know that both sides of the seams are lined up. So that's the purpose of it. It makes sense now. So thank you, Liz, for that handy little tip. Okay, it might be a little difficult to see because it's a dark fabric, but this is the almost finished cover. The only thing left to do is to turn up each of these sections that I left longer, when I cut out the pattern, I gotta fold those under twice and make a seam all the way around the lathe so that it's just sitting maybe a ½ inch or so off of the table. That way, if there's grease or something on the table, it's not soaking up into the cover. So I'm going to flip those underneath and pin them, and then take this back into the house and sew up the seam along the bottom. Okay, and here's what the cover looks like once you've got the bottom seam folded under twice and pinned in place. Takes a little while to get it all even, all the way across the bottom. But once you've got it pinned in place, you're ready to sew that final seam and make it look like a professionally created lathe cover. Okay, and here we have the finished cover with the seam turned over twice and sewn. Or I guess maybe this is called a hem, according to my wife. And all the way around the base you can see that it's nice and straight and flat, and it's just barely, you know, maybe a ½ inch up off the table. That way if I spill some oil on the table, the cloth isn't going to soak it up. But this is what the cover looks like. So overall, I'd say it was a pretty easy project. If you've sewn before, it'd probably be a lot easier. Wasn't very difficult. I would recommend using a single color fabric, because if you use any fabric that has a pattern on it, the pattern won't line up when you try and sew it together. You'd also want to use heavy thread and get the proper needle for the sewing machine. A big, thick, heavy needle for denim. That way you don't break your sewing machine needles. But other than that, it was a pretty simple project and kind of fun. I hate to say it, but not too hard at all. And thanks for watching.